So this is part 3 of a tutorial on the gross anatomy of the muscle system. And here we're going to focus on muscles that act on the scapula and the humerus, which are shoulder muscles. First muscle we're going to look at is the deltoid. And for the deltoid, the origin is going to be the collarbone or clavicle and the shoulder blade or scapula. And the insertion is going to be the humerus. So this muscle will act on the humerus and move it in various ways. So I have 3 images here. One is of the posterior view and on the far left. And if we look, as I trace along the deltoid, we can see the origin there is actually the spine of the scapula. If we look at the anterior view of the deltoid is attaches at the clavicle and the acromion of the scapula, and so all of that is the origin. And the insertion would be over here, lower on the humerus. If we look at the muscle in isolation on the picture in the bottom right, the insertion would be the deltoid tuberosity here. So as this muscle contracts, it can provide various motions depending on how the deltoid is activated. This muscle can abduct or pull the arm away from the body. So that would be an abduction. And depending on whether or not the anterior or posterior portion of the deltoid is acting along with some other muscles, we can also cause rotations in the arm. So the muscle can either medially rotate or laterally rotate, depending on whether the anterior or posterior portion of the deltoid is activated. The other thing this muscle can do, it can help extend or flex or extend the arm. And a flexion is where the arm, if we're looking laterally, the arm is pulled upward, straight upward, and an extension where it would be pulled straight backward. And so we're moving that arm along the sagittal plane. So that's the deltoid muscle. The next muscle we're going to look at is the Pectoralis major. The origin of the pectoralis includes the clavicle, right up along here, and the sternum, and some of the ribs. And so all of this is the origin. And the insertion would be the humerus. So the insertion is down here. We have to go under the deltoid to find the insertion. So we can see that a bit easier if we look at the image of the muscle in isolation. So you can see the origin as I'm tracing it out. And the insertion is over here on the humerus, and specifically the insertion would be on the crest of the greater tuberosity. So this muscle can provide various actions, including a flexion, which is pulling the arm straight up. It can also help adduct, which is going to be to pull the arm inward. And it can rotate the arm medially. And medially makes sense because as the muscle is pulling inward towards the origin, because the origin is on this side, the muscle or the tendon is attached. The attachment's not centered; it's attached around the humerus, so it's attached on this side of the humerus. So when it pulls, it can provide a torque on that humerus. So this would create a rotation medially. So this is the pectoralis major. The next muscle is the infraspinatus. And this one gets its name because of the origin. Its origin is on the scapula, and it's in a location that we learned during the skeletal study of the skeletal system. It's the infraspinous fossa. And so I'm going to trace it out here on the image on the left. This would be the infraspinatus, and the origin would be the infraspinous fossa, and the insertion is going to be on the humerus. And in this case, it's not going to be quite centered on the humerus, just pulling it straight inward. So this can create a torque on the bone, on the humerus, creating a rotation for the action. So the actual insertion is the greater tubercle. So this muscle comes and inserts on the outside of the proximal end of the bone, and that creates that lateral rotation. So if we look at the image in isolation here from the lateral view, there's the origin on the infraspinous fossa, and then the muscle comes here and wraps around the outside of the humerus and attaches right here on the bone. So when the humerus gets pulled, creates a torque for that lateral rotation. So that is the infraspinatus. Now we have another muscle that also creates a rotation. This is the teres major, and its origin is on the scapula, but in this case it's the inferior angle of the scapula. So if we look at the image on the far left, all the muscles that are to the left over here are the superficial muscles. So we have to remove superficial muscles like the trapezius here. And if we get the trapezius out of the way, we can see these muscles, including the infraspinatus we just saw right now. And over here, this is the inferior angle right here, and that's where our teres major comes from. And so its origin is over here, and the insertion actually goes under and around the humerus to the anterior side of the humerus at the lesser tubercle, where the insertion is. So again, that's going to help create a torque on there, which will allow for some rotation. But in this case, the rotation is going to be a medial rotation of the arm. You can see the muscle in isolation over here. There's the origin on the inferior angle and the insertion going towards the front of the humerus over there. And again, that can create that medial rotation. The other thing this muscle can do is extend the arm. And again, the extension is to take the arm and pull it back, straight back along the sagittal plane. And we can also adduct or pull the arm inward. Since overall, if this muscle works with some of the other muscles that adduct, then it would assist in adducting or pulling the arm in against the body. So this is the teres major. Next muscle is the Latissimus dorsi, and this muscle, the origin is on the vertebrae, as well as the ribs and the iliac crest. And so if we look at the origin, if we start over here at about T7 and move all along the spinal column down to the sacrum, so we're going to run from T7 all the way to the sacral vertebrae number 5 down there, as well as over here in the iliac crest, and then some of the ribs in this area here. So all of this is origin for this muscle, and you can see the direction of those fibers and fascicles in this muscle. So that would be drawing the insertion in that direction. Well, the insertion is the humerus, so we're going to be moving the humerus, and the insertion is on the intertubercular groove. So this muscle also wraps around the muscle. The origin is on the dorsal side, but then it wraps around to the anterior side of the humerus. And so again, this can create a torque, causing a rotation. And since it wraps on the inside of the humerus towards and on the anterior side, basically that's going to create a torque that provides a medial rotation. The other thing this muscle can do is extend the arm, and that means to pull the arm straight back, and it can also help adduct, which means to pull the arm inward against the body. So recall that the extension is going to be if you pull the arm straight back along the sagittal plane. And if we look at the image on the far left, you can see both sides, the left and the right, Latissimus dorsi here in the image. And so the part of the trapezius actually lays on top of it. So this muscle is the Latissimus dorsi. Next muscle is the Levator scapulae. And so this gives you an idea. Levator elevates, and scapulae is a reference to the scapula. The origin of this muscle is the cervical vertebrae from C1 to C4. and probably best seen in the image on the image in isolation over here, especially because this muscle is a deeper muscle. So the origin is right up in here in the cervical vertebrae, and the insertion is a scapula, but not on the medial side, or they also call this the vertebral side of the scapula since it's facing the vertebral column. So it's on the superior medial border. All of this is the medial border, but this is the superior medial border there. So when this muscle contracts, if the origin is the cervical vertebrae, then overall we're going to get an upward pull on the scapula, which is why the action is to elevate the scapula. Now, let's say that there are other muscles that act on the scapula that can fix the scapula and keep it from moving. So if we contract that same muscle, then overall we're going to be pulling downward and also creating a torque on those cervical vertebrae. So this can cause the neck to rotate and even help it bend in the direction of the muscle there. So let's take a look at some of the other images and an image of the model to see how we can locate the levator scapulae. Again, the middle image here shows the Latissimus, the trapezius actually is superficial to it. So we remove that from the picture, and we look at the deeper muscles. So we move to the right of this image. There's the scapula right there, the superior border, which is the insertion, and you can see that the muscle moves upward and actually runs underneath the muscle we covered earlier, the splenius capitis. So again, actually locating this muscle on a model should understand the direction of the muscle fibers and the fact that it goes deeper to some of the other muscles that we've seen before. So I do have a model. It's an example of one of the models we have in the lab. And in this case, the image that we were just looking at, and the image of the model here, the superficial and deep muscles are opposite. So here you have on the right side, you have the trapezius, and then on the left side you remove the trapezius, and you have some muscles. This one we're going to see in a little bit. There's the splenius capitis, and then just to the left of that on this image here, that's where you have the left levator scapulae. Words are kind of smaller, but that's what it's pointing to right there. So this would be going down towards the scapula, and if this image was on the rest of the model, you would be able to see that it's headed in that direction. Again, this is the levator scapulae. The next muscle we're going to look at is the pectoralis minor, which is deep or underneath the pectoralis major. So in the image up here on the top left, this would be the pectoralis major that we saw just a while ago. And if we remove that and look at what's underneath, we get what we see on the model on the right side of this image. And these are going to be muscles that attach to the rib and the scapula. And so it might be best to look at the image in isolation down here, where we're looking at the right pectoralis minor. And over here you can see the origin is going to be on the ribs. These are going to be ribs number 3, 4, and 5. And the insertion is going to be the scapula, specifically the coracoid process, which was a structure we saw in the scapula in earlier labs on the skeleton. And so the action of this muscle, one of the actions is to stabilize the scapula. The other thing it could do is if we fix the ribs with some other muscles and we contract, and then we're going to be pulling downward. And if we're pulling downward on the scapula right there, then you're actually lowering the shoulder. So some references will say that it's lowering the glenoid cavity, which is the location where the arm or the humerus bone is located. Another thing that this muscle can do, again, depending on what other muscles are acting on these bones, is that this muscle can elevate the ribs. So let's say we fix the scapula and this muscle contracts, then we're going to get movement in the opposite direction, and then that would help elevate or lift on those ribs because we're pulling upward on them. So that would be another action of that muscle. So again, the actions really do depend on what other muscles are acting on there, but overall, an easy action to remember would be that it can stabilize the scapula on there. And then we see this picture on another image, and there are the bellies of the pectoralis minor. Next muscle is the serratus anterior, and this one kind of looks, so with all the other muscles in place, kind of looks a little bit jagged right there, or serrated, kind of like the knives that have the teeth on them. So that's kind of how I remember that one. But if we were to pull all the other muscles away, we can see what or better see what the origin and insertion are, because the serratus anterior is actually deep to some other muscles in there. So if we look at the lateral view here in isolation, in this image here, we can better see the origin is going to be the ribs, and the origin is going to be ribs 1 through 8. So we got to go all the ribs there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down. So these are the origins there along the ribs, and then you can see somewhat the location, more or less, where the origins would be on the image on the far left. But the insertion is the scapula. In this case, the medial border, which is the vertebral border, that's going to be the inside of the scapula, as well as the inferior angle, which is this portion right there. So the action of these muscles are going to be, again, to stabilize the scapula, just like we saw with the pectoralis minor. But these muscles can also elevate the ribs and can help abduct the scapula. So imagine if these muscles are contracting and they're pulling in this direction there, then they would be pulling outward on the scapula, causing it to abduct, to remove the scapula, to move away from the midline or from the spinal column. So this is the serratus or serratus anterior. The next muscle is the trapezius, which is a superficial muscle. And so we have the image of the trapezius on the far left with some of the other muscles there. So I'm kind of tracing or outlining this muscle to kind of give an idea of its location and to give an idea of what we might call the origins and the insertions. So the origins are basically going to be all along the spinal column, both in the cervical and the thoracic region, as well as the occipital bone up here. So all of that is origin. And so when these muscles are contracting, depending on what part of the trapezius, we're going to get some various motions. So the insertions will include the scapula, specifically the acromion and the spine. The spine is, we're looking at the posterior portion here, that's the spine right there. And so the other insertion is the clavicle or the collarbone up toward the front and on the other side of the image. And so the action would be plenty of actions here. So we can elevate, adduct, and rotate or fix the scapula. So various, depending on what other muscles work with the scapula, we can use it to help fix and keep the scapula from moving. But let's say if we look at this image in isolation of the right trapezius, and we're contracting this portion of the trapezius, well, we're going to be pulling inward on the scapula, so that would adduct or move the scapula inward toward the spinal column. Over here, if we're contracting the upper portion of the trapezius, then we would be pulling up on the spine, and that would help elevate the scapula if we're pulling up on the spine of the scapula. The other thing that this can do is if we fix most of the shoulder there and contract the trapezius, well, now that the trapezius could be pulling basically on the head, because one of the points of attachment is the occipital bone. So now the origin becomes the insertion if we fix the shoulder, and so this can create a bending of the head sideways. And we can also, if the other trapezius is contracting, we can bend the head backwards in an extension. So there's various actions that can be accomplished by the trapezius. So make sure you're able to give me at least one action, if asked for, that fits with these origins and insertions. So this is the trapezius. The next one is the rhomboideus, and some references will just call it the rhomboid. And this is the rhomboideus major, and the origin is going to be the vertebrae, and this specifically thoracic vertebrae, right around here. That would be the origin, and the insertion is going to be the medial border of the scapula, the lower portion right here. And so when this muscle contracts, we're basically going to be pulling the scapula inward. So that's an adduction when you pull a part towards the midline. And then we can also rotate the scapula as well with this particular muscle. And then there's going to be, if we look at the image on the far left, you have to remove, this is a deeper muscle, so you have to remove that trapezius again. And when you remove it, this is what you get on the right side, the deeper muscles. And there would be your rhomboid or rhomboideus major right there. And right above it, superior to it, is the next muscle we're about to cover, which is the rhomboideus minor or rhomboid minor. And again, it's deep. If we have to remove the trapezius, and so the origin is vertebrae, higher up though, so we're in the cervical 7 and to thoracic 1, and around this area right here, and that's the origin. And the insertion is going to be the scapula, and that's going to be the medial border, right where the spine is. So here's the spine right here, and that's our attachment there. So really more like the superior portion of the medial border of the scapula. And so when this one contracts, again, we're going to be pulling on the scapula inward, so that's going to adduct the scapula, and it can also rotate the scapula as well. So this concludes the tutorial on the shoulder muscles that you need to know. Now it's time to practice. Make sure that you practice identifying by name these muscles, either on your body, a model, or an image. And in order to do this, it would be useful to recite and write, because you have to spell them out, the name of the muscle. You also need to know the origin, so you want to recite that, and the insertion, as well as an action. And it must be a short phrase. You cannot just say flexes. So we're flexing the, flexing what? Flexing the arm, like the pectoralis major can do when it pulls the arm straight upward. The other thing you might do is learn some of the actions kinesthetically by actually trying to move your body according to that action there. And if you have any kind of model that allows for moving, even an action figure or something that you have handy, you can try to move those models according to the actions of the muscles. So this concludes the tutorial on muscles of the shoulder.